Efforts to ban certain books from school libraries are gaining steam nationwide. Last month, a Tennessee school board voted to ban the Holocaust-inspired graphic novel Mouse, citing violent imagery and controversial themes on Nazi resistance. Some groups are criticizing the ban, saying the book plays an important role in teaching kids about the Holocaust. As our next guest tells us, the concept of censoring or banning books has its own history lesson. Ada Palmer, an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago and a science fiction author, joins us to discuss. Professor, thank you for joining us. So as we just mentioned, recently the Holocaust graphic novel Mouse pulled from library shelves in a Tennessee school district. The school board reportedly cited the use of 8 curse words and nude imagery in the depiction of a suicide, or a nude imagery of a woman specifically. What's your reaction to the school district's move?
Obscenity is usually what people point to when they want to justify banning a book in America or similar nations like New Zealand or Australia, because obscenity is the thing that we're most comfortable with censoring. But often that isn't really the reason. And we see this when we collect statistics about book objections. So, for example, lots of summer reading lists have romance books on them about teens getting together. And the ones where the teens have a mixed race couple or a non-white couple get objected to much more often than ones with a white couple, even if there isn't any more sexual content in them. Obscenity is the excuse, but often racism or homophobia or anti-Semitism is the actual reason, and people hide it underneath by saying this thing that makes me uncomfortable, I'm going to label it obscenity, even though the discomfort is about something else.
Now, last year, members of a local school board in Downers Grove also voted to remove a book called Gender Queer. It centers on gender identity, of course. Should students have access to books about sexual identity or race in a school library?
Absolutely, because school libraries are there to help kids learn about things so that they don't run into them in the wild and not understand them and not know how to take care of themselves, right? Sex ed helps kids understand their bodies and make prudent choices. It prevents the spread of STDs, and it helps with sexual empowerment and reduces teen pregnancy. Educating kids about drugs reduces drug use. Educating kids about gender helps people understand what they're seeing on the internet, what their friends are going through, what they're seeing people talk about, because they're going to run into these themes on Twitter, on Facebook, in images, and they need the opportunity to look up and learn about it so that they know what it is instead of facing it with ignorance and without guidance.
Of course, in a lot of these debates, we hear from parents who are outspoken about the books they oppose for their children. Who should decide? Who gets to decide which books stay in schools?
Because teachers are experts about the grade level that they teach, right? They look up and know what new books are being released for that age group. They read about the educational needs of that exact year. They talk to their students regularly and find out, what words are they running across online. They really are experts about every specific grade level that they teach. And so they know, these kids are just at the age they're starting to learn the word genocide, and they're scared and they want to know what it is. This is the moment to teach that. So it really needs to be teachers, because experts should be making these decisions who know what those kids need at that moment. And a parent isn't an expert on a particular year the way a teacher is.
Of course, students have argued that they don't always agree with groups who are banning books, say that those books are there for educational purposes. What role does the student voice have in this argument?
I think a very important one, especially because the bans really do affect students very heavily. Whenever there's one of these bans, we see a book like Mouse jump up in the bestseller list, and Mouse sold hugely after the ban was announced. But it isn't kids who are getting the chance to buy those. Those sales are people who are anti-censorship, often in cities in multiple states away, who are buying the book to support the author. But meanwhile, the kids are affected by the ban and affected by that school board decision. They don't have that same access. And it's also going to make their teachers reluctant to assign similar books in future. So the kids need to be listened to, because what they want to have access to and the questions they're asking need to shape the curriculum.
When you look back at the history of censorship, what are some of the similarities between previous movements and the current one?
One of the big ones is that in the modern era, the big way to justify censorship is to say it's about protecting kids. it's the one form of censorship that we find most acceptable. And so lots of different types of censorship have justified themselves under that umbrella while really lashing out much farther. And another important one is that censorship organizations, whether we're talking about the Inquisition or the USSR or modern ones, even ancient ones, one of the patterns is that it's not about trying to destroy books that already exist. It's trying to intimidate people so that they don't produce more books. So if Mouse suddenly spikes, but dozens of schools and school districts across the country become nervous about assigning similar books, for example, Own Voices, memoirs about oppression, then the next dozen really powerful books like Mouse that get published won't sell well because schools will be afraid of them. And then the next dozen after that may not get published at all. The biggest victims of this kind of challenge are the books that will never be produced or never be read because it creates a culture of fear and silence. That's always the goal, or one of the big goals, of censorship.
Okay. Professor Ada Palmer, that's where we'll have to leave it. A lot to think about. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.